Good evening. My name is Ona Alston, and I am a program associate with the Institute for Policy Studies. And on behalf of the Center for Democracy in the Americas, the Nation Institute, and the Institute for Policy Studies, I would like to welcome all of you to our discussion this evening, Is a Democratic Foreign Policy Possible? The Clinton Administration and the Developing World. But before I introduce our moderator for this evening, there are a few housekeeping things I'd like to clear up before we begin. And the first, and perhaps most important to my mind and heart, is an opportunity to remind each and every one of you here about the continuing crisis in Haiti and the absence of the legitimately elected government there. And in that regard, I'd like to let everyone here know that next week, February 7th through the 14th, is Haiti Solidarity Week. There are a wide range of activities planned for the DC area and across the country for that week. Hopefully later on this evening, we'll have an organizer for Haiti Solidarity Week here with us. In the interim, however, I'd like to share a phone number with you to get information about all of the activities that will be occurring, including a major address by President Aristide next Saturday, the 13th. And that phone number is as follows: 301-699-0042. I would also like to take this opportunity to invite everybody that's here this evening to a free reception which will follow immediately after the program at 9 o'clock in the room just outside the entrance to our right. And finally, I would like to ask that when we reach the question and answer portion of our program this evening, that everyone limit his or her questions or comments to a maximum of 3 minutes in order to ensure maximum participation. With that said, I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening. He writes the Minority Report column for The Nation, the Cultural Elite column for Vanity Fair, and has written a number of books, his most recent, which will be published by Verso in April, For the Sake of Argument, and in 1992 spent a tremendous amount of time in Sarajevo and elsewhere in Bosnia, writing reports for a number of publications. Please welcome Mr. Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you, Ona. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. Since C-SPAN is here, I'll go on to say brothers and sisters. And since Pacifica is here, and since C-SPAN is here as well as Pacifica, I'll go on to say also comrades and friends. We are met at what was known in a more bedraggled era as a defining hour. I will not stand between you and panelists better qualified than myself to discuss it, except to say that I want to guide them, and hope you'll be guided in your own thoughts and questions, to rise above the mere tour of the horizon or the random mention of this or that favorite cause. You have, as citizens of this republic, the chance to do better, I think, and to achieve a higher synthesis of the discussion of what it is to live at the heart of the greatest military and imperial, economic and political and military power ever seen in the history of the world, and to realize that that's a matter of very grave responsibility as well as a tremendous, though unasked, privilege. As we speak, this republic has its troops deployed in the Horn of Africa and in the Persian Gulf, and many people are asking why that is at all, or why it still is, and does not have its troops deployed in the Balkans. And many are asking, principally people on the liberal left actually, are asking why that is not so, why there are no American troops in that place, and that may be an irony, and if it is an irony, then we want to have it properly explored this evening. We have an incoming president whose first act in foreign policy was to retreat from a pledge he'd made to the people of Haiti. I can only echo what Ona Alston just said in her very generous introduction to me, and say that, in my opinion, every week should be Solidarity with Haiti Week. And to say further that there is obviously an indissoluble connection between one's attitude to the regime in Haiti and one's attitude to the refugee crisis, and that any politician who attempts to counterpose the refugee crisis to the regime crisis is acting in a spirit of opportunism that one hopes was not borrowed from any immediate predecessor. Surveying also, and we must have some time, I think, to discuss the vulgar question of personnel. Surveying this, there are some queasy symptoms, at least felt by this reviewer, the present critic. I had hoped at least for a Kissinger-free zone to form around the State Department. I was not thrilled to see Winston Lord, who even his closest friends refer to as Lord Winston when he's out of the room, put in charge of East Asia policy. It seemed to me that rather compromised the position taken by the incoming administration on human rights for China, among other countries and states. When Les Aspin turned up in the Pentagon, I feel sure he was gratified to find that his picture had already been hung there, had indeed been hanging there since 1981. With what I have learned of the new head of the CIA, I can't claim to be thrilled or delighted. More details upon request. Lloyd Benson, I think, was the first public figure in America to call for a preemptive nuclear strike on anybody. In his case, he can claim that he was young and it was Korea, but nonetheless. In other words, we have much before us. I'm very buoyed up in the thought of a serious discussion by the people I'm about to introduce. I'll take a little time to introduce each of them as they appear before you. I'm going to start with Bill Leogrand and say merely this. Many of you obviously know his work, and many of you will have read his stuff and seen him debating with elegance and intelligence and courage during the bipartisan war that was waged on the people of Central America in the last administration. I noticed all that too, read it, watched it, so forth. But I also had the privilege at that period when he was very, very sapiently advising the few dissenters from what was and mustn't be forgotten as having been a bipartisan congressional war, Congress's war, voted for by Congress, funds applied for by Congress. Only then the loopholes are filled in by the piratical entrepreneur of, as I say, to complete a long sentence, of talking to Bill privately as he advised some of those in Congress who were thoughtful enough to try and reason a strategy of opposition to an undeclared and a shameful conflict. So, with gratitude for that, and with very warm memories of the help he gave me, I'm going to invite him to give you the privilege of listening to him. And for those of you who are only hearing him for the first time, I can only say I'm envious. Bill?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Let me begin also by thanking the Institute for Policy Studies and the Nation Institute and the Center for Democracy in the Americas for organizing this forum, and thank all of you in the audience who've braved such frigid weather to come out and listen to us all. One of the reasons that I agreed to participate in this evening's event is because the title of our program is so intriguingly ambiguous. Is a democratic foreign policy possible? Now, does that mean democratic with a big D? If so, that would seem to imply that after 12 years out of the White House, the Democrats might not be capable of mounting a foreign policy distinctive from that of the Republicans. I don't happen to share that view, but that certainly could be one interpretation of our title this evening. Or alternatively, does the program title mean democratic with a small d, which I suspect is more along the lines of what the organizers had in mind? But then that just opens up other questions. Does a small d democratic foreign policy mean one that is aimed mainly at promoting democracy abroad, or does it mean one that is formulated through a more open and democratic political process here at home? After Iran-Contra, BCCI, Iraq-Gate, etc., it seems to me we could probably use a bit more democracy in our own foreign policy formulation process than we've seen over the last 12 years. In point of fact, it seems to me that the Clinton administration faces challenges in all three of these areas. First, in crafting a foreign policy vision that is distinctively big D democratic, and I mean by that not a partisan foreign policy, but one which responds to the new challenges of the post-Cold War era in a distinctive way. Second, that the administration will have to grapple with both the philosophical and practical dilemmas of promoting democracy, because that's already been articulated as, if not at least one of the organizing principles that the Clinton administration wishes to found its foreign policy on. And finally, I think President Clinton will have to resist the instinct of every chief executive to formulate foreign policy within the councils of his own chief advisors, presenting it to Congress after the fact as a fait accompli. It is, of course, much messier to consult with Congress in advance and try and hammer out a foreign policy which has broad and democratic support in the Congress and in the land, but it is also a lot easier to carry out a policy like that once you've come up with it. I think if we learned anything from the Reagan years, at least, it is a danger not only to other countries but to our own republic when an administration decides that it has the right to formulate its foreign policy not only regardless of Congress but even in opposition to it. But first, let me talk about the vision thing. I think it's fair to say that the organizing principle of American foreign policy since 1945 was to fight the global struggle against the Soviet Union and its allies, that is to say, to fight the Cold War. No new central theme has yet arisen to take the place of this central principle. For some conservatives, the disappearance of the Soviet Union has led them to lose interest in a great part of the world, and we saw that in Patrick Buchanan's race for the presidency when he really advocated what amounted to a new isolationism, putting America first, as he called it. For many Democrats, I think the end of the Cold War has led to greater focus on international economic issues. And indeed, this was a tendency that one could see among certain segments of the foreign policy community, even during, and in fact, to some degree before the Reagan and Bush years. But now, with the end of the Cold War, I think has come to full flowering. And this, too, is an area where President Clinton has already said he intends to focus a good deal of his attention. Certainly, for those of us like myself who study Latin America, the dominant issue in U.S.-Latin American relations today is certainly the North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico and the prospect that that agreement might be broadened out to include a variety of other countries. For other Democrats, the end of the Cold War has meant an opportunity to mount a new international campaign, but this time on behalf of democracy. I think it's fair to say that there's really no agreement within the foreign policy community about these principles, no agreement even among Democrats, that's big D, Democrats, about which of these three principles ought to be center stage in our foreign policy in the years ahead. And I would guess that there's probably not today a clear agreement within the new administration about which of these principles ought to be center stage. Certainly there are people, I think isolationism obviously is not going to be high on the administration's agenda, but between international economics as a focus of policy and promoting democracy as a focus of policy, I think there will be some tension among senior officials. And I would also point out, of course, that the problems of the budget deficit, the desire of the President to focus on our domestic problems, is not isolationism in itself, but it tends to reinforce the tendency, particularly in the public at large, a significant tendency in the public at large, to not want to pay much attention to the rest of the world, or at least to goodly parts of it. Let me talk a little bit more about the call to make the promotion of democracy a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, because it is essentially a call for a moral foreign policy, for a foreign policy that pursues something more noble than the cold calculus of national interest and security inherent in Henry Kissinger's realpolitik or Jeane Kirkpatrick's embrace of moderately authoritarian regimes. And I think here the call to promote democracy is, in this sense, kin to Jimmy Carter's human rights policy. And I must say that in that sense, it has a certain tug on the hearts of many liberal Democrats. But a moral foreign policy, of course, has its dangers. It is, at root, an effort to influence the way in which other societies organize their politics and their affairs. And more than once, of course, the United States has found that such efforts can have unintended and very costly consequences. This is a debate that goes back a very long way in the history of American foreign policy, as any of you who are students of history know very well. It is, if you will, a debate between realists and what used to be called idealists, but I've seen a recent reference in the press to neo-Wilsonians as the new idealist notion. But it is very simply an argument about the extent to which American values ought to not just inform our policy, but be conveyed abroad by our policy. It is, I think, a disagreement which is somewhat different than the disagreement that has split the foreign policy establishment, the foreign policy community of the United States over the last 20 years. Between the war in Vietnam and the fall of Gorbachev, I think it would be fair to say that the fundamental division within the foreign policy community of the United States was between hawks and doves, between people who thought that the war in Vietnam had been right and should have been pursued, and thought that the decisions to disengage were mistaken, and who spent much of the next 20 years trying to rebuild in the public and in the Congress a consensus for future use of military force in the Third World. And doves, on the other hand, who tended to be, after Vietnam, deeply suspicious of the efficacy and morality of the massive use of force in the Third World. I think that that division has been largely done away with by the end of the Cold War, by the victory of American forces in the Persian Gulf, and by, in part, just the passage of time. But in its place comes, I think now, this division between realists and neo-Wilsonians, which tends to cross-cut traditional cleavages. The division between hawks and doves really reinforced partisan divisions between Republicans and most Democrats, although not all, as Christopher has already named some of the few who stood on the other side of that barricade. But by and large, most Democrats and most Republicans divided equally or divided similarly along the same lines as hawks and doves. And ideologically, obviously, this was a line of cleavage between conservatives and most liberals. But the realist-idealist division cross-cuts these cleavages and makes, I think, strange bedfellows, precisely because everyone would like to see the values that they value carried, if not abroad, at least promulgated in the world. After all, in some sense, that's what we mean when we speak of morality. It's the sense not only that we ought to do things, but that other people ought to do them as well, because they are, after all, moral. So there is a tendency for the injection of moral values in foreign policy to lead to the efforts to promulgate those values abroad. I don't think that it's an impulse that closely follows partisan or ideological lines. I want to talk a little bit before I turn the podium over to the following speakers about some of the practical places where the administration is going to have to deal with these challenges and begin to answer these questions. And I want to focus on Latin America because it is the area of the world that I know the best. We've already heard some talk about Haiti, where there is probably the most acute immediate crisis that the new administration has to face. In Bill Clinton's favor, I would say I think he has come to office recognizing that the only long-term solution to the problem of refugees leaving Haiti is to solve the political problem of Haiti, and that is to see the restoration of the democratically elected government. And the administration is hard at work in pursuing that. Whether it is successful, I think, and how quickly it can move on that issue ought to be ultimately the yardstick by which we judge the decision to extend George Bush's immigration policy in the short term. There are at least 4 other places in Latin America where there are crises which are more or less acute. And then I want to talk about a crisis which is not so acute and not so visible, but in some ways even more important. Peru is a country where the weaknesses of existing democratic institutions, the drug war, and Maoist guerrillas all come together to form the most intractable mess any place in the hemisphere. I am thankfully not a specialist on Peru, and so I have some excuse for having no good advice as to what the United States ought to do there. And I don't have any positive, solid advice, but I would offer the new administration 2 cautionary notes. Don't get drawn into a military counterinsurgency campaign against the Shining Path guerrillas in the name of anti-narcotics trafficking. And don't let the terrorism of Shining Path become an excuse for tolerating the human rights violations by the Peruvian armed forces. In Nicaragua, we have a country whose incipient democratic institutions are at risk of falling apart under the dual pressure of economic destitution and internal bickering within the country's political elite. Here I do have some advice. I think the United States can play an enormously positive role in Nicaragua by supporting President Chamorro's efforts at internal reconciliation and by providing her with the economic assistance that we have promised her. It seems to me that there is no reason for a democratic government in the United States to hold up economic assistance to Nicaragua at the whim of Senator Jesse Helms. In El Salvador, we have a very fragile peace agreement that seems perpetually on the verge of collapse because the armed forces refuses to give up ultimately its veto power over the political system. El Salvador is a place where the glass is perpetually half empty and half full. The peace agreement hasn't worked out anything like people originally envisioned it would, and it has had difficulties all the way. And yet, at each stage of difficulty, both sides have been willing to sit down at the table and renew the negotiation to try and solve the problem. And no one has started shooting at each other again. And so, in that sense, I like to think of the glass as being half full. Here, too, the United States can play an enormously important role by holding the Cristiani government and the armed forces to compliance with the peace plan that they signed. This is still a country that depends very much on economic assistance from the United States, but more so even the armed forces is in many ways the creation of the last decade of United States policy. Having purchased all of this leverage at great cost in both lives and dollars, it seems to me now we ought to put it to better use than we have. And finally, in Cuba, where an economic crisis caused by the collapse of the Soviet Union has everyone wondering how long Fidel Castro can last and what will happen on the island if he goes. Let me say that I think Cuba policy is such a hot domestic issue, such a hot potato in domestic American politics, that we are not likely to see a very significant departure from previous policy. Rather than making an argument in favor of such a change, let me offer, I think, again, a small bit of advice. With the passage of the Torricelli Bill last year, which many of you may be aware of, the United States tightened economic sanctions on Cuba, and we did it despite the opposition of many of our allies in Latin America and Europe. The essence of the legislation that was passed prohibits American corporations, subsidiaries of American corporations, in other countries from trading with Cuba, thus putting many of those subsidiaries at odds with the governments of the countries in which they operate. This year, it seems to me, the United States ought to be thinking hard about what it might do in concert with those same allies in Latin America and in Europe to promote a positive program of reform in Cuba, rather than simply tightening the screws and waiting for the place to explode. I think anyone who looks closely at the issue of Cuba will recognize that significant political turmoil or violence in Cuba does not serve the interests of the people of the United States or the people of Cuba or the people of South Florida, for that matter. These are the immediate crises that the United States faces in the region. It's difficult to know at this point what the broad thrust of our policy in the hemisphere is likely to be from the Clinton administration, because a number of key appointments have not yet been made. But I do want to say in closing that apart from these very acute crises, which will no doubt consume the time and attention of senior officials over the next months and even years, behind these acute crises there is another crisis which is not so visible, and that's the crisis of slow or no economic growth in many countries in Latin America and in the rest of the third world as well, for that matter. Economic recessions that have eroded the standard of living of millions of people, damaged the environment, caused a breakdown of public health, and created, in some cases, international health emergencies, and produced literally misery for millions and millions of people. This is a crisis that cannot be ignored, no matter how agile the administration is in moving from one acute crisis to another and solving one acute crisis or another. There will always be another crisis on the horizon unless these deeper structural economic problems are addressed. And if the United States wants to promote democracy in Latin America, or anywhere else for that matter, we should not focus only on the remedial actions that we are prepared to take when democratic norms are violated. We must also focus on preventive measures, on policies that improve the life conditions of ordinary people and thereby create the economic climate in which democratic institutions can grow and flourish. When it comes to supporting and promoting democracy, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Thank you very much.
Well, I thought, thank you, Bill, very much, that your presentation of the matrix upon which our discussion should proceed couldn't have been more admirable. I've become used over the years to what I would like to call, and I hope you won't mind me calling it, something professorial in your style. I always like slightly to decode and even occasionally to deconstruct the professorial discourse, and if I heard you right, you were hinting that if the United States wants to promote democracy, it should be a democracy. Indeed, I remember observing something similar in your defense of the right of Congress to sort of be involved in policy in the bad old days. But anyway, not to put words in your mouth, this chair will, as the evening proceeds, entertain questions that capture that thought. I also like what you said very much about unintended consequences, and this will help me to introduce Holly Burkholt, whose consequence is by no means unintended, but there are such consequences. It was remiss of me, for example, not to mention in my introduction the Palestinian Revolution and the long struggle of the United States to come to terms with the existence of this fact. And an unintended consequence, I think, might perhaps be that whereas more or less openly and more or less intentionally, the Bush-Quayle-Baker regime fought very hard for the victory in the last Israeli elections of a party, the Israeli Labour Party, that is a member party of the Socialist International. Not to everyone's taste, but there it is. The Clinton-Gore campaign in that same election fought very hard for an endorsement of the position of the party of Yitzhak Shamir, which isn't a member of any international at all, and for good and sufficient reason. The unintended consequence of this is that the first action of a supposedly more enlightened Israeli government has been to reinstitute the nightmare of mass deportation, the nightmare among which and under which Palestinians have always felt themselves to live. And uncomprehended, though, that fear of deportation may be, the Rabin government made it very plain as I think anyone could make it, by saying you won't just be deported, and it won't just be from your ancestral home, but it will be to southern Lebanon. I think, therefore, we see the unintended consequence in action here as the Clinton-Gore campaign confronts the actions of a government that it, in principle, has a fraternity with. Another unintended consequence that's come about recently is this. I can remember when American foreign policy was loudly organized around the idea that there must be free elections in Angola. You probably remember it too. I even remember the person they thought they ought to have win the election. I remember the money raised, the arms sent, the conditions levied upon the newly independent government of Angola, the necessity for expelling Cubans, this and that. Then I remember there was an election, and I remember who won it. And now, I think those who see what the losing side in that election is doing, reverting to tribalism and violence and the open defiance of an electoral verdict, and destroying the remaining provenance of a newly independent African country, may also have cause to reflect on whether that's what they really wanted. When I first started studying the Savimbi phenomenon, I called Holly Burkhalter at the then fairly newly established bit of the Africa section of Human Rights Watch, which has evolved, I think, as the most serious and comprehensive human rights, I hate the word umbrella, because of its association with so many other wrong concepts that are not of the parapluie. But anyway, human rights organizing and thinking collective. And I've never regretted that call. It didn't just help me then, it's helped me innumerable times since. Rather than tell you how I've benefited from Holly's advice and experience in this regard, I will let you benefit from it yourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, Holly, forward.
Oh dear, afraid I've broken this. Just... I guess it just has to...
Oh, John. There's something horrendous about the entire symbolism of this. Here, let me see if I can...
Too,
yes. And we're on television, my God.
Well, I'll have to
and
shout.
I've got my pen.
I'll have to shout, but if you can't hear me, please make signals.
How is that? Are we audible at the rear? Good.
Thanks very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for permitting me the honor of joining you this evening. Thank you for coming, and my appreciation to my fellow panelists and to the, various institutes that have planned this evening.
Speaking as both a moderator and occasional contributor, I have never known this to fail.
Here we are. One of the least edifying spectacles I think I've ever seen in my life is the sight of official Washington discussing with furrowed brow and measured tone what's going on in Bosnia, in the former Yugoslavia. And the litany goes something like this, that the end of the Cold War and the end of Soviet-style Stalinist governments in the region has unleashed a torrent of long-suppressed ethnic hatreds and violence that are now spilling everywhere. And the implication is strong that if we could only go back to the good old days of communism when all of this stuff was kept under wraps. I find that particularly repugnant coming from those people who were merrily spilling the blood of many, many thousands of Salvadorans, Nicaraguans, Angolans, Vietnamese, Chileans, and assorted third world denizens in the cause of suppressing communism, which is now, of course, thought to be what we most need to suppress ethnic violence everywhere. But never mind that. I mean, it's very clear that official Washington doesn't have a clue how we got to this horrible state in the world today, and they certainly don't have any good ideas how to respond. But having said that, I'm not so sure we do either. For the last 12 years, those of us in the human rights and peace community have had our hands absolutely chock full with the things we have been against. We've had lots of work to do, and we've been remarkably successful. And by we, I mean citizens' movements and people who finally forced their elected representatives in Congress to listen to them. We've had our hands full dealing with things like finally cutting off aid to the Nicaraguan Contras and ending that horrible war, and forcing Congress, asking Congress to enact, and which it finally did, a comprehensive anti-apartheid act against South Africa, which ended the Reagan-era constructive engagement with the apartheid regime. Citizens' movements have finally made Washington, for example, sit up and pay attention to Somalia, which was everyone preferred would not be noticed, at least through the Republican National Convention in July. But having had our hands full with what we've been against, we now have, at least we can act like we have the opportunity to find out what we're for and demand that our government represent that. In coming up with an analysis of what we're for, I think we're going to have to re-examine some of the things we've been quite committed to as individuals, perhaps, and as organizations, too. One of them might be that talk is always better, that negotiations are always better than an end to negotiations, that talk is always preferable to action. And the reason this has to be tested, of course, is because of the horrible disaster that the negotiations over Bosnia have led to. And it causes us to test our own views and our own thoughts about the role of international mediation in ending conflict, strife, and in this case, genocide. I won't make Bosnia the focus of my remarks, but I feel impelled to say a little bit about what's happened and what's required, because it's so much a part of finding in our own minds anyway a notion of what we want our government to act for in the world today, in a vastly different world that we have inherited at the end of the Cold War. The situation I am not one that says there is no place for negotiations in the former Yugoslavia. But I think it's very clear that the endless talking shop that have been presided over by men of decency and goodwill has essentially handed the Serbians the victory that they might not have got on the battlefield, and that winter is now completing the ethnic cleansing while all parties talk, and participation in peace talks has essentially persuaded the international community, and most specifically the Europeans, that there isn't a problem, or that the problem will be dealt with in the form of negotiations that will end in, someday down the road, some sort of solution to all this mess. But meantime, the entire region is awash in refugees who may be permanent refugees from their homes, awash in a tidal wave of abuses that justly deserve the name of genocide, which is what they are and what they are intended to produce. The question of humanitarian intervention is a loaded one and a difficult one, and there are many, many ways to do it wrongly. But it's a question that has got to be on our minds, and it very much must inform our views of our own government, the role for our own Pentagon, and it must inform our views of what we think about the UN. I, for one, think that the UN is our best hope for the future, and I think it's done a ghastly job to date in many areas of the world. Having said that, I hope that partial UN successes in trouble spots like El Salvador and Cambodia could help inform a future UN role and a different UN role in places like former Yugoslavia and Somalia. One way to do it, the humanitarian intervention question, wrong, I think, is to willy-nilly send hundreds of thousands of troops to the region, to draw lines in the sand, to try to separate the combatants, to put in place arbitrary carvings up of the region that have been decided by negotiators. But I think there is a role, and I think it's this one in that conflict, which might be a model for the way we'd like to see the UN act in other places where it will inevitably be called to do so. One is you go back to the bargaining table, you go back to the negotiations, and you put humanitarian and human rights issues not last on the agenda, but first. It is not something that you wait to take care of when you've decided on the grand scheme for a political solution that satisfies all parties, but you put it as number one. You put the participants in the conflict at the table, and the negotiators keep them there with a threat of international sanctions hanging over their heads until they agree to what's number one on the agenda, permitting food and fuel and medicines to get into all beleaguered communities, and to ending the siege of cities, and to ending attacks on civilians by all the parties of the ethnic minorities in their midst. And you hold them to those sacred promises, and then when they violate them, you bring in the United Nations machinery to punish them for those violations. Now, I'm not going to prescribe what the punishment should be. There's a lot of talk about enforcing the no-fly zone, strategic attacks on weapons batteries, etc. That's not my job as a human rights community to say what the punishment should be. But the UN has reached solemn agreements embodied in many Security Council resolutions, which have unfortunately been absolutely irrelevant to what has continued to go on the ground. And if we want the international body to play the role that was envisioned for it at its creation, and if we want the UN to stand in for the might that was used so terribly by the superpowers, then we'd better insist upon a proper role, and we'd better insist that our own government make such a proper role possible, which means paying up our dues, but it also means calling it as we see it when UN negotiations have failed. It means offering to go in with other nations by way of enforcing UN Security Council resolutions and sanctions. And that means not just in Bosnia but elsewhere. Moving from there, which I think is a topic for lots of questions and a broader discussion, because I know that all of us in the human rights and peace community have ambivalent feelings and worried opinions about humanitarian intervention, whether it's in Bosnia or whether it's in Somalia. But I do think that we have the wit to imagine a way that it could be done right. I happen to have been a supporter of the U.S. intervention in Somalia, which I think has been done wrong. But we can, through conversation with the affected peoples, first and foremost, and with other parties of goodwill, to find ways that the international community can work together to stop the worst atrocities going on in our midst. What exactly do we want the Clinton administration to do? And I can't come up with a complete agenda. We don't have enough time. But I guess I'd start by saying I want President Clinton to make good on some of his campaign promises and to ignore some of the others. He can make good on his promises on China, for example, to in some way or another inject human rights considerations into our trade relationships with China. He promised to do so in the campaign, and we expect him to hold that commitment. Unfortunately, one of the earliest utterances of the presidency-elect, actually, a month or so ago, was to observe that actually China seemed to be getting better in the last couple of months. Apparently, since the U.S. elections, China's improved its human rights. I failed to observe it in my capacity as human rights monitor, but it struck me that it was the first step in a weasel walk away from a campaign commitment. However, on a brighter note, I would depart from my friend and moderator, Chris Hitchens, and say that I take some heart in the appointment for Asia policy of Ambassador Winston Lord, who is no flaming liberal. He is a lifelong Republican, but in his previous post as U.S. ambassador to China, he cared a great deal about human rights, and when he left the ambassadorship, he emerged as a critic of the Bush administration's policy, and he was strongly pressured not to by the president of his own party, and he did anyway. And he didn't go as far on an activist position towards China as I would, but he was definitely a friend in that cause. And the appointment of Ambassador Lord has sent shockwaves in Beijing, and that's a very good thing. We'll hold him to a high standard, but I think that the appointment itself has already been symbolically significant. We want President Clinton to abide by his campaign commitments on Haiti, and as other panelists have said, it is a very sad moment indeed when among the first things that the President has done is send a message to all of the countries in the world that the United States, which is among the poorer and smaller nations of the world, as we know, cannot take a beleaguered refugee community onto our shores. The signal that sends to little Malawi, for example, which has 1 million Mozambicans in that country, what it sends to Sudan, what it sends to, certainly the signal it sends to Croatia, which is home to over 1 million refugees and displaced people, is horrible. It also says that, that even under a Democratic administration, still under a Democratic administration, we will not abide by international law. The decision on returning Haitians without a hearing is not just a violation of commitment, it's not just immoral, it's flatly illegal. And it's so too bad to see that. Among the first acts has been to thumb the nose at the whole body of international human rights law, which is one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. So thus, we would like to see him hold to his commitment on Haiti, and I have lots of suggestions on how he could do so, which we can get at during questions. Obviously, I want the President to depart from his campaign commitments on Israel. It was really too bad that the Democrats' Democratic policy couldn't even come up to mid-shin of what the Bush administration has done in this area over the last couple of years. The Republicans have been much more outspoken about abuses and have, for the first time in my experience in the human rights field, have been willing to actually hold back some promised U.S. assistance to the Israeli to protest the illegal policy of settlements in the West Bank. President-elect Clinton criticized that very harshly during the campaign, and it is not a good sign. I have hopes that once in the saddle, the foreign policy bureaucracy, which knows a loser when it sees it, will have some modulating influence on the administration. But this is one campaign pledge that needs to be reconsidered and revisited. What else do we want from the new president? We'd like him to obey international law, and we'd like him to obey our laws, and which we haven't seen for a long time. Other panelists have mentioned the sort of lack of democracy, the lying to Congress, which to me is the most important thing of all. That means lying to us. That you go to jail for that, or you should go to jail for that. And we're all for really vigorous enforcement of violations. As a matter of fact, President Clinton himself has personally murdered people for violations of the law. One remembers that as governor of the state, he put people to their death in the electric chair for violations of the law. But when one gets into very high office and violates the law, then they don't, not only do they, certainly they are not electrocuted, nor should they be, but they don't do not a day's worth of time in jail. And I think all of us would have been really pleased and edified to have seen at least Elliot Abrams wear some stripes for a certain period of time. But speaking a little more specifically, I don't think it goes without saying that we have. The law of the land has been for quite some time. My former boss, Tom Harkin, was the author of this law, that the United States is not to provide assistance, economic and military assistance, to egregious abusers of human rights. And you'd never know it was the law of the land when you look over the terrain of the last 12 years. But it is the law. It is still the law. Black words on white paper mean what they say, and we should insist that they be followed. I think we are going to see, and we've already seen, a certain disengagement from the really unsavory beneficiaries of our previous largesse, Mobutu Sese Seko and Zaire being the richest of them, and unfortunately, one of the longest lived. But it's not over. That era of providing large amounts of military and economic assistance to the world's biggest thugs and robbers and thieves and torturers is not necessarily over, and that's law. That is our law. We own it. It belongs to us, and we should see that it's enforced. Finally, I think there is a whole world of opportunity in the area of injecting concern for international worker rights in our trade relationships all over the world. The concept of a social charter in the context of negotiating new trade relationships is hardly a novel one. The Europeans have been doing it for years in their own dealings with one another and with the third world. But if you make such a suggestion in this town, it's as if you've suddenly proposed that one mate outside one's species. It is so alien to our concept of what constitutes trade. And it is also worth noting here that we have a law that says that protection of it, that violation of international worker rights should be considered an unfair trade practice. Just as we consider dumping and improper subsidies and violations of patent and copyright, all things that the business community is abundantly familiar with. They put those laws in and then they damn well expect to see them enforced. What is so dramatic about putting the human costs of unfair trading practice, such as union busting, employment of children, obscene working conditions and inhumane working conditions? That should also be an unfair trade practice. And our trade negotiators, when they go into negotiations and go head to head with our allies, with our competitors, with the people we trade with, those issues should be first on the table. And I think we should expect that of them. In conclusion, I want to take one quick stab at the question before us, which is a democratic foreign policy possible? And I wasn't very optimistic until Zoe Baird and the spectacle of the American people roaring really loudly on the notion that privileged people do not get to break the law. That's not all right with us. On the notion that there is a population here that is very often silent. They heard, they saw it, they didn't like it. And in my view, it had nothing to do with the employment of refugees. I really don't think that was a xenophobic, anti-refugee sentiment. I think that was about privilege. And I think that the fact that Americans rose up and said, no, says something very positive to me about the possibility for a humane foreign policy. It says that, and the fact that Congress got the message, and Clinton got the message, and she was history in about 12 hours, is the best news I've seen yet for the possibility of a humane and democratic-oriented foreign policy in the Clinton administration. Thank you.
Well, I told you she was terrific, and I would add to that, now you've actually seen the performance. You notice she can mention electrocution in one sentence and Elliot Abrams in the next and still make it deniable and still keep you guessing. That's a skill that doesn't come, just from... Also that, and I commend this to everybody, that she only says finally and in conclusion once each, okay? As a veteran of these kinds of things, and in a movement that we know depends upon volunteers, like Holly, who I thank very much, that's also a privilege. Now, I'm always sad that I can never intone the majestic words of, I think, Thomas Jefferson, that he trembled for his country when he thought that God was just. I can never intone them convincingly because I don't have his faith, but I do tremble to think that we may all be viewed by millions of our fellow citizens of the world, I mean, some years from now, we may all be judged by what we did or did not do about Bosnia in this period of pure, armed, racist massacre. I think it's a shameful and sobering thought that we might be judged by that standard. I think it's a standard we would do well to apply to ourselves. If Americans and American politicians and journalists are indifferent to it, they will not find this indifference replicated in the rest of the world. They will particularly not find it replicated in the Muslim world. I'm defining that broadly. I mean, as broadly as, shall we say, Egypt, Turkey, and Iran and beyond, where what is happening is clearly and painfully understood and is used, I think, sometimes demagogically, but nonetheless truthfully and authentically as the illustration of what is meant by the double standard of Kuwait. I would intrude, by the way, to anyone here who takes a fundamentalist view of that I think this double standard is itself misleading. I'll mention a favorite subject of my own and say that I personally watched the forcible removal in 1974, 75, and 76 of every Greek-speaking person from the northern tier of Cyprus by the Turkish army. Another action, by the way, fully underwritten, financed, and supported by the United States government and Congress, but nonetheless, a tryout on cleansing that remains to this day unredeemed. I think we have to take a non-sectarian attitude to cleansing. In fact, I don't think we could do better than take the Bosnian attitude to it. The Bosnian Declaration of Independence describes the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina as a state for equal rights for all Muslims, all Serbs, all Croats, and all Jewish and Albanian minorities. I think that should be our standard in foreign policy. Internationalism, in other words, is our cry. And Jack, who I was just about to say was a great internationalist, has left me to do some sort of Victor Borge act here. Let me see how much I can free associate on the internationalist question. I think, well, I will just say for Jack, I'll say what I was going to say about him, and if anyone has a, just in case anyone doesn't know who he is, I was a little depressed, perhaps because it made me feel older, when discussion of the recent film biography of Malcolm X counterposed the militancy of Malcolm X, Malcolm Little, and the relative moderation of the movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King. Perhaps it says something about my age. I don't remember it as being all that moderate a movement. What I remember particularly about the movement led and founded by Dr. King was that it took the crucial step, a step it was urged by many black leaders to avoid, which was to connect the struggle for civil rights to the struggle against the war in Vietnam, and to move, by taking that decision, into a zone of extreme hazard politically, and one of extreme courage in those who led it. It's a source of pride to us that we have with us this evening someone who was involved in those decisions and involved in the courageous side of taking them, and that's Jack O'Dell. He came to my attention a little earlier when one of the very few, I think not the only, but one of the few hereditary columnists at the Washington Post, Lally Weymouth, was writing a piece about the dangers of the Rainbow Coalition. And she said, well, one of the things that made it very, very clear that the Reverend Jackson's movement was extremely dangerous and subversive was the presence of Jack O'Dell in its leading councils. And I remember thinking, I must seek this guy out. And I'm very glad indeed that I did. And Jack, we will spare your blushes. That was by way of introducing you as a staunch internationalist, fighter for civil rights, and recognizer of the connection between international order and law and the rights of all Americans, in which you've distinguished yourself so much. So, approach, if you will, this platform which is now yours. Jack, well done.
Oh, boy. Thank you. I dare touch this. I'm very happy to be here this evening and to share this event with all of my panelists. And I want to express our appreciation to the Nation Institute and the Institute for Policy Studies and the Center for Democracy in the Americas for having had the vision and the foresight and the commitment to recognize that this discussion was needed. This is a period of high hopes and expectations. Many of us witnessed the inaugural events, and we saw the projection of ideas and feelings, and we have a sense of the people's hopes riding high in this period, because it is the people of our country that in the November elections, history may record, pulled our nation back from the brink. Despite limited choices offered by the two-party system, the popular will for change was registered unmistakably. Over 100 million people went to the polls to cast their ballot, reversing a 30-year trend of decline in presidential elections. And these voters insisted upon changes in the domestic crisis in our country. They insisted that the real problems of our society be discussed, debated by the presidential candidates. They rejected mudslinging and other irrelevant discussions. And as a result, all of us benefited from what we might say the threshold of denial that was lowered during these presidential election season. And they unelected George Bush and repudiated the Reagan-Bush era in our national life. But they did more than this. They turned to new leadership for a new agenda. They elected twice as many women candidates to the Senate and House. They doubled the numbers of the Congressional Black Caucus who were elected and the Latino caucus. They elected a solid block of progressives that they expect to carry a progressive agenda. And so in discussing tonight, is a democratic foreign policy possible? One point of reference for us is a recognition that these elections were a setback and a defeat for the most racist, most militarist sections of the military-industrial complex. In this expression of the popular will for change, the people of our country created space for the struggle for a new agenda of national priorities, for jobs and health care and the restoration of the public school system, and other urgent needs to overcome years of neglect. Is a democratic foreign policy possible? Our peace and justice movement has historically been a vehicle for demystifying foreign policy. It starts with a recognition that we come up in a political culture in which domestic and foreign policy are viewed as separate concerns, and people are encouraged to get involved perhaps in so-called domestic issues, but foreign policy, that's to be left to the experts. But our movement has developed its own experts to compete for the public mind, and I believe that the results of the recent election in the opening up of the process of change is in effect the results of this years of activity that our movement put into educating and organizing a movement for change. Martin Luther King was one of the pioneers in this effort of demystifying foreign policy. And many of you will recall, as I do, the Riverside Church speech that he delivered in April the 4th, 1967. And among the things he called attention to in that speech was his observation that any nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense and on programs of social uplift is a nation approaching spiritual death. 25 years or more have passed since that prophetic observation, and we have seen symptoms of spiritual death as we witness painfully our neighborhoods in a state of siege from gang warfares and drugs. We have painfully observed the conditions of the homeless, the result of neglect of affordable housing. We are aware of the sense of hopelessness among long-term unemployed and helplessness among families who have, having lost their jobs, face losses of their health care insurance in case they face serious illness. And so demystifying foreign policy has been one of the critical questions for our movement. And we know from experience that the Great Society, with its promises of improving the life of our society, went aground because of the foreign policy that led us into a racist criminal war against the people of Vietnam. Cold War foreign policy has dominated our society for more than 40 years. We are feeling the effects of the results of scientists being deployed to work on military production. 2/3 of all the research and development money spent by the federal government over 2 decades has gone for military research. And one of the byproducts of that has been the loss of the United States' position in the world economy, and that has resulted in manufacturing base contracting, the shift to a service economy, the decline in manufacturing jobs, a steady decline in per capita income as union jobs in steel and auto and packing and maritime fell apart. This decline is traceable in large measure to a foreign policy that resulted in the militarization of our economy over the last 40 years. And now we face a situation in which we see a world which shows signs that we are entering a protracted era of global instability, unmatched in the 20th century. Poverty, famine, the disintegration of nations into tribal and ethnic groups, pervasive violence, these are all the byproducts of 40 years of excessive obsession with militarism. Well, is a democratic foreign policy possible? This ruin that we are witnessing in our own country is paralleled with ruin in other parts of the developing world. The foreign policy our nation has pursued during this era of the Cold War has seen us support Liberia, Samuel Doe, and the decimation of that country. In Cambodia, supporting Pol Pot. In Haiti, Duvalier. In Somalia, Siad Barre. It's a long litany of ills and grievances that gives us today a universal situation of de-development and pain and suffering. And we've seen a human rights double standard in our foreign policy in relation to witnessing the expulsion of hundreds of Palestinians in Israel's military occupation and the unconscionable destruction of Vietnam. At another time of crisis in our national history, Abraham Lincoln said, "We cannot escape history." And I think those words ring for us today. We cannot escape the experience of ruin within our own country as our foreign policy spreads ruin around the developing world. Our nation is being de-developed by the same forces of the military-industrial complex. Is a democratic foreign policy possible? It is clear that it is a necessity if we are to avoid the national tragedy of physical decomposition and spiritual death. A foreign policy that is democratic by definition must be a foreign policy for our country based upon the search for political solutions to problems in cooperation with countries around the world. It must represent respect for international law. It must be a foreign policy that sets a standard that is unassailable in its upholding of human rights. Our nation needs a foreign policy that contributes to the promotion of economic justice in the world as the basis for peaceful relations. And so the necessity of this kind of foreign policy and awareness of it can enable us to create the political will that will make it possible. Organized, enlightened public opinion is capable of reshaping the foreign policy of our country and letting the Congress and the President know what our expectations are. We must move from being simply a protest movement to one with a vision that understands what is needed and tells our government what is needed and makes it imperative that the government carries that out. Today, we are reminded of Martin Luther King's words that the world expects of America a maturity we may not be able to achieve. Well, we are struggling to achieve that maturity and taking the initiative to reshape our nation's relations to the international community as part of that. And in that reshaping, we will be guided by a moral concern which regards our spirit of concern for the victims of Hurricane Andrew on the same level that we would take that group of victims and regard them no less, but we also must regard ourselves with the victims of Desert Storm and the victims of Operation Just Cause, the invasion of Panama, where 4,000 people were killed while asleep in their beds in a midnight invasion. Our common humanity dictates that these disasters be avoided in the future. And yet we know that the maturity we seek is one that has a shadow, a foreboding one hanging over us. For indeed, a specter haunts the world today. 25 years after Martin Luther King's words, it is the specter of a new world order of chaos, militarism, famine, and epidemic violence, presided over by a lone superpower, armed with the biggest military machine in history, fueled by a culture of institutional racism and national chauvinism, fashioned during the decades of the Cold War, a military machine that is now available for serving the economic royalists of Latin America, the landed gentry and industrial compradors and feudal monarchs of the Middle East in exchange for geopolitical concessions. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we will save our country. Is a democracy, a democratic foreign policy possible? It is possible, yes, if the level of our political will makes it happen. The mobilization of the students and the unemployed and the farmers and the women's movement and the African American community and the Latino and Asian American and Native American communities, the environmentalists, the disarmament and anti-intervention movement, these are the forces that will make a difference in the foreign policy of our country. And that movement must have a vision that enables us not only to move back on the road of social progress, but to lift up a vision that enables us to close ranks with relation to our standard with relation to the rest of the world. For the industrialized world, we have fallen behind in health care and paid vacations by law and family leave and unemployment compensation and universal pension coverage. Instead of being number one, we have fallen far behind during these years of the Cold War. And so there is a great agenda that we face that will enable us to restore our country to the norms of industrial progressive civilization. And yet this movement that we speak of that must emerge is now armed also with the emerging science of peace and conflict resolution. In these closing years of the 20th century, the summation of experience that has been created by the people in El Salvador and South Africa and the Philippines and other areas of the developing world, and the science of peace that indeed we are involved in right here with the struggle to dismantle the military-industrial complex. Here on our North American continent, the movement that is developing between the three countries, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, to defeat NAFTA, yes, but to move on to an economic community of cooperation while health care and housing and environmental standards are maintained. The science of peace is linked inseparably today with the science of human progress. And so this is a hopeful period, but also one in which we must reinforce our determination. And I'm reminded of Maya Angelou's poem, her inaugural poem, in which a message to all of us is sent when she says, "Lift up your eyes upon this day breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream. Lift up your face. You have a piercing need for this bright morning dawning for you. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." Thank you.
I'd like to thank Jack O'Dell, as you did, for both reminding us of our best traditions and also for, in his own person, exemplifying them. And to thank him and his fellow panelists also for being so courteous and scrupulous about their time, which is an admonition I now want to lay upon all of you as you approach the microphone with questions or contributions. I can only say I will be ruthless with anyone who's a bore, and you might bear that in mind. And you'll be shown up as a bore or a crank on TV, too, if you go on. I just wanted to add a little to what Jack said. I think the sense of the discussion so far is as follows, that there is no clear feeling in this meeting or among analysts, both less and better qualified than ourselves, as to quite whose hand is on the tiller or the trigger at the moment in these grave and weighty matters of policy. One might instance, for example, a man who was obviously very gratified to be called Commander-in-Chief even a couple of days before he was sworn in as such, obviously liked being called Commander-in-Chief even at the Lincoln Memorial, but who, when he deals with his appointees, men who hold their commissions purely by his favor, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, deals with them rather as if they were the lobby of the National Association of Manufacturers. Now, Norman Birnbaum pointed out to me today, well, of course they are a lobby, the Defense Department, and of course I couldn't agree more, but it's funny as to when and as to where and as to how and on what occasions the great might of the Eagle and the presidency and the Constitution and the great traditions is invoked and when it is not. I'm sure you'll be bearing all this in mind. I'm going to start from this microphone.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We have seen in the last year, I think, an unprecedented emergence of citizen activism in a new form, in the form of in-your-face politics. A lot of campaigns, particularly involving young people, taking their message to the politicians far more forcefully than has conventionally been done simply through phone calling and letter writing. The peace and human rights community is also an activistic community. And I'm wondering what each of you, in your expertise, see a need for in terms of bringing this new activism to bear on these questions when we are not faced with the immediate call for, say, something on the scale of a full-scale Gulf War protest. What else can we do to advocate a proactive agenda?
Well, I hope everyone will have that question in mind as they think and contribute. And I'll recognize the gentleman at this microphone.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about uncertainty and confusion, which I know as a long-time activist in anti-war and anti-intervention movements, I've been feeling the last year or two. For a long time, from the Vietnam War on, I felt quite certain about what my goals were in terms of foreign policy. Stop the war in Vietnam, stop aid to the Contras, and so on. And now I find myself much less certain of what's right and where we want to be going. In particular, I'd like the panelists to address the national question, which I think is one of the most complicated and difficult and tricky questions. I mean, it comes up very strongly in the case of Bosnia. It comes up in the case of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, which is splintering. In my mind, it may be unrealistic for us to assume that various national boundaries which have been drawn over the last few decades, such as those in Czechoslovakia or those in what were considered hardly more than provinces in Yugoslavia, to be permanent boundaries, and that people shall live forever within those boundaries. And I would, it may very well be, for example, that the Czechs and Slovaks are more of a model for how the various nations of the world may conduct themselves, rather than the Serbs and Croats who are apparently holding on to national identities and national territories.
I think that we're about to be able to move to replies from the panel, but before we do that, I want to recognize Joanne Landy, who's standing just behind you. I'm going to break with a strict alternation, excuse me, sir. Just as a whim, really, because you may not know this, but I know that Joanne, who chairs the Campaign for Peace and Democracy, originally the Campaign for Peace and Democracy East and West, was one of the crucial organizers of the idea that there should be a cross-border relationship between human rights and political action and democracy, and sustained this idea very brilliantly during the period of the Cold War, helping to bring into contact activists in both Warsaw Pact and NATO countries, and is still carrying the banner of citizen action and, I'm embarrassing you, and internationalism in this even more trying time. I think that when she's spoken, we will probably be able to invite the panel to give responses. At least I'm pretty sure I guessed right. Joanne.
Well, thanks. I think that Holly and Jack O'Dell were quite right in pointing us in the direction of thinking about what are we for and not just what are we against. And I think it was a mistaken luxury on our part to think during all those years of Bush-Reagan that we could get away with just reacting, because now we're paying the price of not really being prepared as this new agenda, as this new administration comes in, to say in a coherent way what we're for. I'd like to focus on one question, which is the question of intervention, because it's right in front of us now every place we look. And I would just like to say that I don't think there's going to be any happy resolution to this problem of what do you do when some egregious massacre or violation of human rights happens around the world. You're not going to be able to deal with this in any happy way until we manage to carry out a fundamental democratization of global security and economic institutions. Now that sounds like a tall order. You say, well, wait, what do you expect this guy Clinton to do? Well, I actually don't expect him to do that, unfortunately, but I think our job is to make it very clear that that's what we think is involved, because if you don't, I'll just take the question of the UN right now, which is everyone's panacea to the horrible history of U.S. unilateralism. Look at the United Nations. Look who really counts there. The Security Council, that's who counts there, and the people who run it are the strong powers that emerged after World War II, and the modernizers say, let's deal with that by adding Japan and Germany, the new real powers. Well, what about the rest of the world? What about, why should people respect the intervention, even for noble purposes, of people whose deep purposes are to perpetuate unequal relations of power and wealth in the world? Okay, I would only also suggest that this same criterion has to be, and same approach has to be taken up with the global economic order as well. Who controls the IMF? Who controls the World Bank? Well, we know who controls it, and it's not the people who can be trusted to carry out these decisions. Now, I think the question of how do we do that, I don't have a formula for it, but I think the approach is the same thing that Christopher referred to about what at least my organization worked towards during the Cold War, which is to strengthen civic movements, grassroots movements around the world which have as their real interest, not just instrumental interest, but their real interest, the promotion of equality and human rights. And I think it's through strengthening those movements in each country that we have hope of transforming the global institutions, which right now cannot be trusted, even though I might, under certain circumstances, backed into a corner, be for some kind of limited intervention here or there. But we're going to get ourselves deeper and deeper into it until we tackle this harder task of global transformation.
Good, John. Thank you very much. I hope John has brought copies of Peace and Democracy News to distribute. If you get a chance to get one off her, you should. If you don't, you should make an arrangement to get it in the mail. Now, I think I'm going to invite the panel now to see if they have responses. And I'm going to try and phrase a question that I hope summarizes some of the feeling of the meeting. It's an old principle of debate, Holly, gentlemen, that one doesn't make the best the enemy of the good, and that because one can't do everything, one therefore doesn't say one can do nothing. I wonder if any of you have thought of a positive use for American power or a positive inhibition against the use of it arising out of our discussions this evening, and whether you'd specify what that would be. And I think we'll take you in the order of your original appearance, which puts the professor
Well, you
the
see,
frame.
you've actually stolen the last point that I was going to make in summing up the question. I think in response to the first questioner, Jack O'Dell gave you the answer. It's essential to have a positive vision and not just be in opposition constantly. No doubt there will be things that this administration does that people will oppose, and hopefully there'll be more things that this administration will do that people will support. But it is essential to have a positive overall vision of what the foreign policy of the United States ought to be, and to put that vision forward in a convincing way to your friends, to your neighbors, to your elected representatives, and occasionally to people in the administration as well. I think this issue of intervention is a very difficult one indeed, and I think Christopher puts the question exactly right. Are there times when the use of force abroad is justified? What are those times? And what kinds of safeguards have to be involved in them to prevent self-interested intervention masquerading as something else? There is, of course, these days much talk of humanitarian intervention based on the Somalia example. And I must confess some sympathy for the use of force in occasions such as that, when the lives of tens of thousands and perhaps even millions of people may depend upon a humanitarian effort backed up by the force of arms. But on the other hand, I'm also, being a Latin Americanist, very well aware that lots of our interventions in Latin America at the turn of the century were dressed up in very nice clothes and very nice rhetoric about democracy and building health care and educational systems in Latin American countries, which in fact we did, although we made a mess of their politics in the process of doing it. I think that the answer to the question about nationalities and nationalism in some ways involves the same kind of basic principles that one has to look at whenever you talk about resolving political conflict, whether it's based on nationalism or ideology or anything else. And that is that conflicts ought to be resolved without the use of force. They ought to be resolved on a democratic, that's a small d, democratic basis. And they ought to be, particularly in the case of nationalities, have to be resolved in ways that respect the rights of remaining minorities. And I think within the boundaries of those three principles, and perhaps a couple of others that people in the audience may be able to come up with, one ought to be free to experiment with and discuss all kinds of resolutions of issues like borders and whatnot.
Good. Thank you, Bill. Jack?
Jack just gave me his time.
Excuse me.
I'm going to seize it and yours, Chris, actually. First of all, in answer to Christopher's question, is there a proper role and use for American power? I think yes. I think the task is for the United States to lend its great treasure and or its horrible treasure, if you will, to the United Nations in the help of creating a permanent standing force, a multilateral force, to respond quickly and properly and effectively to the truly great disasters in the world. Having said that, I have 6 guidelines for it. 1, the intervention must be disinterested. It cannot be done at the behest of one party for purposes of beating up on another. It has to be exclusively for averting the true crimes against humanity of the order that we have seen in the world today. It's not, a Grenada-style fig leaf to allegedly rescue a handful of... That won't cut it. It has to be truly a response to a great disaster. By saying disinterested, I mean to say that the participants may not be those that have something to gain from the intervention. 3, it has to be minimalist in scope, objective, and duration, meaning that you go in, you do the least possible militarily that is required to satisfy the purposes of going in, which is to avert crimes against humanity. 4 or 5, I've lost track of my numbers here. 4?
That's the thing about saying you've got 6.
It must.
I tried to warn you, but...
Such an intervention must be used not first but last. It is not a substitute for negotiation. It is not a substitute for peace efforts. It is not a substitute for humane and decent foreign policies that might have averted disaster. It is not a fig leaf to cover up for past horrors, such as the Iraq Gulf War was, of course. And it should be used last, not first. However, having said that, it doesn't mean that when you say used last, the notion of using force is put off for so long that then all of the choices are bad and terrible, which is the case in Bosnia today. And then 6, it has to be democratically determined and democratically supported. In answer to the person who talked about in-your-face activism, first, a word of thanks for in-your-face activism. Very much thanks for that. It's required in the civil rights movement, in the women's liberation movement, in the anti-AIDS movement, in the human rights movement, in the peace movement, and we need you, so keep doing it. I guess the message I would most want to see in Congress's face, who are our people, who act for us, who are there because we put them there, is first stay involved in international issues. People have run in droves from serving on the various foreign affairs committees because they perceive that their constituents don't support it. People have got to go to their congressmen at town meetings, in their letters, in their visits or their sit-ins at the offices and say, what are you doing on the issues of the day that matter to me as a voter in your district? 2, the message should be, don't sell arms, and what are you doing to end the sale of arms and to open up more transparency in the commercial sales of arms? And what are you doing to stop it? 3, are we paying our dues at the UN, and if not, why not, and are you helping do that, and what's your opinion on the U.S. paying up its dues, every cent of them, and then some? 4, are we writing in labor rights baskets into trade agreements, and you can start with the NAFTA, and where do you stand on that, the congressman or woman that represents me? 5, are we abiding by our own laws? What's the foreign aid budget look like this year, and is it in keeping with our solemn obligations under U.S. and international law? And 6, what are you as an individual doing in the area of official investigation, inquiry, denunciation, and stigmatization of the true tyrants of the world today? Thank you.
Well said.
I did want to say...
Jack, of course,
yes.
You haven't surrendered all your rights. But I know
I'll use the rest of Holly's time. Just very briefly, I think the focus on, when we think of this activism, the focus of carrying out a program enunciated by Sain Fries of securing a 50% reduction in the military budget over the next 3 years, or $50 billion a year for the next 3 years. That's going to be a battle. And combining that with a reconversion program to a peacetime economy, the thorough demilitarizing of the economy with those distorted national priorities. That is the unfinished agenda that must be, in my judgment, pursued. Now, in terms of this question of intervention, one of the things that's striking about certain wars we've seen, like Panama and Iraq, is that even when the Security Council of the UN was used as to use the term, the fig leaf to cover it, the fact is there was never any attempt to get the UN General Assembly to be involved in that. That is the body that represents the world. The 16 countries of the UN General Assembly, and 5 of them having veto power, that's a distortion of the purpose of the United Nations. So I think that the question of the involvement of the UN General Assembly as an international body is one of the conditions that ought to go along with these 6 that Holly's talking about.
Good, thank you, Jack. You've been very patient, sir.
Yeah, this was not intended to be a response to what you just said, and I share your goals, but I just don't think they'll happen. I think that America will become a more democratic, will be more democratic in its foreign policy, but I think that speaks in one sense of the way Mr. Leo Grant was talking about, in the sense that people, not necessarily the people, will be more likely to dictate foreign policy. And I think the people, and I won't use the again, but the people who will be dictating it will be the people who support Ross Perot, who want to take this, quote, country back for the people, whatever. I think that's what happened in Zoe Baird, and quite frankly, what happened in Zoe Baird happened right soon thereafter with against gay rights in the military. It's the same people who called in, and it's also the same people, sadly, who are going to be against any type of our paying dues in the UN.
Not wishing to be the sort of chairman of the National Town Meeting that I suspect Ross Perot wanted himself to be, I will refrain from comment and invite the next contributor.
What I wanted to ask was if there was a possibility that we might see an end to the cynicism that's often been the hallmark of foreign policy. I mean, I think that, you know, beyond realism and idealism, I think the guiding principle for foreign policy over the past 12 years has been a deep abiding cynicism in the way that we've propped up, you know, repressive regimes such as Guatemala and Indonesia and so forth, without even bothering to bring attention of their abuses to the world, and also the way in which we pit countries in their conflicts against each other cynically, like the way we both aided Iran and Iraq during the Persian Gulf War against each other, depending on which side was winning. What I'm wondering from the panelists is there a possibility that American foreign policy can move beyond cynicism toward real guiding principles?
I see the pens of the panelists are racing, but I'm going to allow as many more questions as I can. I hope, though, one of you will answer the question that I should have brought up myself, of the atrocious record of divide and rule in the countries of the Persian Gulf, and also the damaging consequences that manifestly had on American domestic democracy. Your turn, sir.
Just wanted to point out two things that have almost never been touched on in foreign policy. One is the difference between state and nation. There are nearly 200 states in the world, but there are thousands of nations. There are hundreds of them in the Americas alone, the indigenous peoples of the world. None of these people have any seat in the United Nations. And a lot of the wars going on in the world today, especially in places like Africa and Asia, are in large part because of nations wanting to become states. The second thing is that to have a foreign policy, we need a planet on which to have it. And we need to shift from, say, shipping weapons around the world to starting to ship healthcare and water filtration systems and alternative energy. We are currently refusing to spend a few $billion to get the third world not to build freon-containing devices, for example, that threaten the integrity of the ecosystem. A small percentage of the worldwide military budget could fund all the preventive health care you could want, stop deforestation, stop desertification, educate women, literacy programs, everything that everyone would ever want, and we'd still have a lot of money left over. And this is the type of paradigm shift that I think can catch on, but I fear the U.S. is going to get dragged kicking and screaming by the rest of the world into this. And finally, I just want to point out that I think everyone should read Gore's book, because he talks a little bit about this in some of his recommendations, and we need to hold them to it. We shouldn't have all the faxes going into the White House coming from the moral majority.
Sir.
Well, recently the Clinton transition team did something that has not been done for a very long time. That's consulting Africans on matters relating to foreign policy in the United States. Unfortunately, they consulted this, the usual suspects. They, Mansour Khalid of Sudan and Adam Kojo and Obasanjo and so on. While this is a very good step in the right direction, I think that circle could be widened to include other, people and other ideas. But my question is that when we talk about human rights and the abuse of human rights in places like the Sudan and Ethiopia, Somalia, and other places in Africa, most of the time these situations are brought about by struggles for self-determination. Some nationalities who found themselves within those borders drawn by the colonialist powers are trying to get out of these confinements, and they're trying to to carve a place for themselves in the new world order. My question is does the panelists, do the panelists think that the Clinton administration would somehow extricate itself from the trappings of dealing with the central governments of the Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia, and try to see that the nationalities that are seeking self-determination are, or at least that issue is addressed as a part of the human rights situation? Thank you.
Good, very good question. People to people, as it were, diplomacy, a different definition of public diplomacy from the one that we've had recently, I think. I'm going to try and do two more on each side, and then I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we will have to ask the panelists to wrap with a closing statement. But you, sir.
Ms. Burkhalter, you said originally that you were a supporter of intervention in Somalia, but that you thought that the policy had gone wrong. I was wondering if you could expand on that. How has it gone wrong, do you think, and is it salvageable?
Admirable model question. Ma'am. Please.
Thank you for this opportunity, but I just today came from a meeting at the Goddard Center where they were discussing some very recent research in military endeavors. Frightening research. Lots of money going into that kind of destructive materials which we couldn't cope with. It's unbelievable. Keep your eyes out if you want to read about it. It will be out later, but it's rather secretive now. I was born in '05, so you know I went through a lot of wars and peace movements, protests. I remember when I was 12 years old, I was told by my teacher that we should do something for the starving Armenians. So I went home to my mother. We lived in Washington. And I asked my mother what we could do. Well, she said, you mean to raise some funds for them? And I said, well, I would like to, but I wonder if we could do that with I'm So Young, Mother. She said, we'll do it together. How about a strawberry festival? So we got strawberries and we dipped strawberries in powder and strawberry ice cream for something special and strawberry cake, and you could get one strawberry for a penny. We raised $25 and sent it to Mr. Hoover. I'm sorry. So, you know the end of that story. Today, things are going so fast. I've protested all the way along the line, and somebody told me today, look, this is not a protest, this is research. So where do we come to a middle ground there? This is research that I heard today, that we can destroy things through merely having a little a gusset, a screw on the end of a plane in the wrong place, and by George, your plane goes down from your own efforts to keep it up. If things are changing, they're changing so rapidly. And I see that one time I had space to work and to teach my little children of my own and the other children in Washington for years and years. And it was time, but still today there is no time. It's too rapid. We've got to pin on one thing, certainly, while we try to do 100 million other things. Please keep your good health, your good spirits, be able to laugh at our damn fool mistakes, but we know we are on the right path if we have a good spirit. And don't let other things come in and crush it. And now I want to ask from a friend here, could we please have the essences, or at least that of the speeches which have preceded us at the program, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am. I think there are two very necessary admonitions in what was just said. One is never believe that bad as things are, they can't get worse. And the other is always be aware to whom your petition and also your check is really addressed. And I think these are lessons for life as well as politics. You, sir, and I'm afraid you'll be the last questioner, because I will then have to invite the panelists to conclude.
Yes, Mr. Leo Grande, I disagree with you in asserting that the Clinton administration is hard at work in trying to find a solution to the Haitian crisis. I think more accurately, the administration is trying to cope with the crisis. And the policy of blockading the Haitians, I think, points in that direction. I do agree with you, however, that he has come to realize that the root cause of the problem is the restoration of democracy to Haiti. And I think that realization came from the relentless voices of the Haitian people, and in conjunction with the people in this country that have shown tremendous solidarity with the Haitian people. In asking the question, is a democratic foreign policy possible, I would ask the question another way. Is the American public, is the North American public ready and willing to do what is necessary to have a democratic foreign policy? As Haiti Solidarity Week approaches, I think that people in this country have an opportunity to force their elected officials to adopt a democratic foreign policy. And I think that's what the question is all about. Is the North American public ready for democratic foreign policy?
Good. Well, I would like to apologize to all those who were waiting at the microphone and didn't get the chance. I would like to thank all those who did get there for their good manners and consideration. I'd like to invite all three panelists now, perhaps in reverse order, for the sake of variety, to respond as they choose to the questions that have been asked them severally and separately. And of course, I'll rely on you not to answer a question that your immediate predecessors already addressed. From that end then, Holly, would you commence?
I wanted to make a comment about the question on nation versus state, and go back to my introductory remarks about this notion that somehow totalitarianism was really good for human rights because it allegedly suppressed ethnic conflicts. It did not. It fomented them. And the wave of ethnic identification and the miniaturization of the human collections is a result of nations having suppressed the development of civil society, suppressed legitimate endeavor and community endeavor at every level. And inevitably, when such circumstances exist, people seek to identify themselves another way. If the nation state does not represent them, and if it suppresses all efforts to join in communities, in labor unions, in scholarly groups, in peasant organizations, then they will identify with their ethnic group, with their family, with tribe, with clan, and that goes for Europe as well as Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America. I don't have an answer to the question about nation versus state, but I would say that the miniaturization of, for example, the continent of Africa or of Bosnia is not necessarily the key to future prosperity or peace in the region, and that a different conception of state that permits, not only permits, but ensures opportunities for democratic participation is what's required, and how one gets that, I don't know. A quick word about cynicism and whether there's an opportunity to move beyond it. I recently read an article by the Heritage Foundation which called for an end to military and other kinds of aid to such Cold War allies as Mobutu of Zaire and others. Now, when the ultra-right arrives at where Human Rights Watch is on such matters, I'd say we've got a pretty healthy consensus going here. The real problem, I think, is then what do we substitute for that? And I have a fear that disengagement will not be benign but malign, and it's called throwing up your hands after you've helped to create a mess and walking away. And so I think that disengagement is only the first part of that formula, and some form of positive support and positive engagement is what must follow but will not inevitably follow. And then finally, a very quick answer to a very quick and good question about Somalia. I think that the military has actually done quite a good job in Somalia. They have been quite restrained. They sent too many people to do the job, but that is the new Pentagon, which is to avoid taking any casualties at all. You send about 100 times as many forces as you actually need to get the job done. But then the mistake in Somalia has not been really made by our military people, in my view. It's more been made by the political people. And the mistake has been to only sit down at the negotiating table, both locally and at the larger meetings in Addis Ababa, with the people that ruined Somalia. Ali Mahdi, Muhammad Aidid, Jess, Morgan, the other 4 or 5 thugs and killers who ruined the country, instead of trying to develop some kind of a national consensus by bringing forward and nurturing representatives of a far broader array of Somali society. And that wasn't the military that did that wrong. That was the people that are organizing the sort of political operations in Somalia. The U.S. has done it wrong, and the UN is going to inherit it and do it wrong as well. But that was my reference to Somalia, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Holly.
You suggested we not repeat the previous questions.
If possible, and bear in mind, I'm sorry, I wish I could control the running of the clock, but I don't.
All right, so I'll just stick to I won't be repeating. One brother raised a question, is the North American population ready for a progressive foreign policy in relation to Haiti? My answer to that is an unequivocal yes. And the reason I say that is because what our people, in my judgment, are ready for is to hear what our movement has to say about the relationship between foreign policy and their aspirations for a better life in our country. That breaking down that dichotomy and projecting that foreign policy is indeed a domestic issue, the moment for that is now, and that will affect our relations with people all over the world.
Well said. Thank you. Bill, in closing.
Well, 2 points, I guess, in response to the question about whether or not the Clinton administration can extricate itself from dealing with central governments. Let me say just quickly that a good ambassador and his staff deals not just with the central government, but deals also with a great variety of people, ethnic nationalities, political leaders, and so on. And I'm expecting better ambassadors from a Democratic administration. The issue, I think, to that problem lies not only among people like yourselves who are prepared and interested to see the United States involved in the world in a positive way, but also responsibility here lies with the government itself to some degree to try and overcome that cynicism by itself being open to the democratization of foreign policy, by conducting a foreign policy which is open and not secretive, by conducting a foreign policy in concert with the Congress and with public opinion, and not in contempt of the Constitution, which is what we've seen, frankly, for the last 12 years.
Thank you very much, Professor Leogrand, and all of you. And all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to take a moment, if I may, of your time before we close. At the rear of this hall, you'll find a very eloquent appeal written on behalf of Americans for freedom in former Yugoslavia. I would urge everyone to take one home with them. And I want to make a small proposal of my own. If I'm right about the way that this discussion's gone and the intellectual atmosphere in which it's been conducted, I think that there's an unresolved problem in our discourse. That is to say, those who might wish for this or that good policy or intervention to be adopted by the government basically do not trust those into whose hands they would give the power to intervene. To take, for example, my own chosen cause, that of the martyred and slaughtered people of Bosnia, victims of the filthy practice of ethnic cleansing and the forcible imposition of apartheid. I don't want to see them go the way of the Kurds. Might be the way I would put my point. The last time we were summoned to war in the name of a small martyred people, we know very well how those small martyred people were discounted by those who had shouted most loudly for the intervention. Need we face this as a sterile false antithesis? I am proposing that perhaps we need not. In the struggle to defend the Spanish Republic, it was American citizens who decided that if the great powers would continue the farce of intervention, ordinary citizens need not. I and a group of others are contemplating the following appeal. That is to say that citizens of this republic and of others are invited to donate to the government of Bosnia directly, and that they earmark their checks and donations and say, these are not for bandages, this is not for food, this is not for humanitarian aid, this is for the self-defense that is denied you by hypocritically imposed international embargo. Really going along on this road might conceivably involve us in a little civil disobedience, but it's a lot better than the alternative of complicity. I want, while the cameras are still with us, to ask you whether, if faced with that proposition, any of you here would say aye.
Aye.
Not bad. Not great, but not bad. Very well. I've taken enough of your time. You have, by your presence here, I think, shown it is not true that apathy is the ruling principle. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the panelists. You will, I hope, all consider yourselves, I hope, consider yourselves invited to the reception in the adjoining room. Thank you again.